On the morning of March 17th, 1983, at approximately 9:42 a.m., FBI Special Agent Catherine Rhodes stood in the basement of a townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, holding a blue composition notebook with water-stained edges and handwriting in 2 languages. Before we continue with how this single discovery exposed an entire Soviet spy network operating across America, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We publish meticulously researched Cold War espionage stories weekly, uncovering the documented truth behind operations that changed history and destroyed families. The townhouse belonged to Thomas Andrew Garrett, a 46-year-old electronics consultant who had been arrested 3 hours earlier on suspicion of espionage. Rhodes, 39 years old, had spent 8 years with the FBI's Washington Field Office Counterintelligence Division, participating in dozens of searches of residences belonging to suspected Soviet intelligence assets. Most searches had produced standard evidence: cameras for photographing documents, undeveloped film, unusual cash amounts, shortwave radios configured for coded transmissions. But the notebook Rhodes held would prove fundamentally different. It would unlock not merely Garrett's espionage activities, but an entire Soviet intelligence network that had operated in the United States for over a decade. The notebook measured approximately 7 inches by 9 inches, with a blue cardboard cover warped from moisture exposure. Pages contained handwritten entries in English and Russian, though Rhodes needed translation services to confirm the second language. Some entries bore dates, others did not. Some consisted of single words or brief phrases, others extended for paragraphs. Handwriting quality varied dramatically, suggesting entries made under different circumstances, some careful, others hasty. Rhodes had discovered the notebook inside a cardboard box placed on a basement storage shelf, labeled Tax Records 1978 to 1980 in black marker. Inside, beneath several folders containing actual tax documents, she found the notebook alongside 3 other items: a spiral-bound notepad with pages of coded numbers, a manila envelope containing approximately $2,400 in $20 bills, and a small address book with entries using only first names or initials. Thomas Andrew Garrett had been born in 1937 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father, William Garrett, worked as an accountant for a steel manufacturing company. His mother, Dorothy, taught school. According to FBI background files compiled during the investigation, Thomas had been academically capable with particular strength in mathematics and science. He graduated from Carnegie Mellon University in 1959 with a degree in electrical engineering, then worked several years at Westinghouse Electric Corporation in Pittsburgh, developing control systems for industrial applications. In 1964, Thomas married Linda Patterson, a social worker he met through mutual friends. Their daughter, Jennifer, was born in 1966. The family lived in a modest house in a Pittsburgh suburb. Thomas's career progressed steadily but not spectacularly, receiving regular promotions and salary increases without reaching senior management. In 1973, Thomas left Westinghouse and started his own consulting business, specializing in industrial electronics and control systems. The business proved moderately successful, providing comfortable family income. In 1976, the family moved to the Washington, D.C. area when Thomas secured several consulting contracts with companies working on government projects. They initially rented an apartment in Falls Church, Virginia, then purchased the Arlington townhouse in 1978. According to later FBI interviews with neighbors and business associates, Thomas Garrett appeared entirely conventional: quiet, professional, reliable, somewhat reserved. He maintained cordial relationships with neighbors without being particularly social. He attended his daughter's school events and occasionally hosted dinner parties with business contacts. His marriage to Linda appeared stable. There were no obvious signs of financial difficulties, unexplained absences, or unusual behavior that might have raised suspicion. The FBI's interest in Thomas Garrett emerged gradually from small anomalies that, examined together, suggested possible espionage activity. The investigation began in August 1982, 7 months before the notebook's discovery. The initial trigger was a routine security review of companies holding Department of Defense contracts. Thomas Garrett's consulting business, operating as Garrett Technical Services, had contracts with 3 firms working on defense-related projects. While Garrett's company lacked direct access to classified information, the firms he consulted for possessed such access, and his work sometimes involved systems interfacing with classified programs. During the security review, a Defense Investigative Service analyst noticed Garrett had traveled to Canada 7 separate times over 3 years. Travel to Canada was not inherently suspicious. Millions of Americans visited regularly for tourism, business, or family. However, the frequency of Garrett's trips, combined with his lack of documented business clients in Canada and absence of known family or personal connections there, was flagged as a potential anomaly, warranting further investigation. The Defense Investigative Service shared this information with the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. FBI analysts began examining Garrett's background more closely, reviewing financial records, travel history, employment records, and personal associations. Most findings appeared entirely normal. However, several additional anomalies emerged. First, Garrett's business income showed unexplained variations. In some years, his consulting business earned slightly more than expected based on documented contracts and clients. The excess amounts were not large, typically between $8,000 and $15,000 annually, but suggested income from undocumented sources. Second, Garrett had made several large cash deposits into his personal bank account over 5 years, ranging from $3,000 to $7,000 at irregular intervals. When questioned by bank personnel during routine compliance reviews, Garrett explained these deposits as payment from clients preferring cash, which was plausible but difficult to verify. Third, telephone records showed Garrett made periodic calls to a number registered to an import-export business in Montreal, Canada. The business was legitimate with no apparent connection to Soviet intelligence. However, call frequency, approximately once every 6 to 8 weeks, seemed excessive for someone claiming no business relationships in Canada. None of these anomalies constituted proof of espionage. Individually, each could be explained innocuously. Collectively, they created a pattern warranting closer scrutiny. In October 1982, the FBI opened a formal counterintelligence investigation of Thomas Garrett, codenamed Blueprint. The investigation proceeded methodically. FBI agents conducted discreet interviews with Garrett's neighbors, business associates, and acquaintances, using cover stories about routine security clearance updates. They obtained authorization for wiretaps on Garrett's home and business telephone lines. They initiated physical surveillance, documenting his movements, meetings, and activities. For 2 months, surveillance produced little significance. Garrett's routine appeared entirely ordinary. He worked from a small rented office in an Arlington commercial building. He met clients at their offices or restaurants. He attended industry conferences. He went home evenings, had dinner with his wife and daughter, watched television, went to bed. On weekends, he did yard work, grocery shopping, attended his daughter's high school basketball games. Wiretaps proved similarly unrevealing. Garrett's telephone conversations consisted of routine business discussions, domestic matters with his wife, brief conversations with his daughter. and occasional social calls with friends. There were no coded messages, suspicious contacts, or indications of clandestine activity. Then, on December 14, 1982, surveillance captured something unusual. Garrett left his office at approximately 2:30 p.m., earlier than typical. Instead of driving home, he drove to Tyson's Corner Center, a large shopping mall in McLean, Virginia, parking and entering through the main entrance. FBI agents conducting foot surveillance followed Garrett through the mall. He walked through several department stores, occasionally pausing to examine merchandise without making purchases. His behavior suggested counter-surveillance awareness. He doubled back several times, stopped abruptly to look in store windows while apparently watching reflections, and took an escalator to the second floor, only to immediately take a different escalator back down. After approximately 30 minutes of seemingly aimless wandering, Garrett entered a bookstore, browsed the fiction section for several minutes, then selected a paperback novel and purchased it. After leaving the bookstore, he walked to the mall's food court, purchased a soft drink, and sat at a table. According to FBI surveillance reports, Garrett sat at the food court table for approximately 8 minutes, appearing to read his newly purchased novel. At approximately 3:45 p.m., a man approached Garrett's table and asked if the adjacent seat was taken. Garrett shook his head, indicating availability. The man sat down. The two men did not appear to acknowledge each other beyond this brief exchange. Garrett continued reading his book. The other man ate what appeared to be a sandwich purchased from food court vendors. After approximately 5 minutes, the other man stood up, gathered his trash, and walked away. Garrett remained seated for another few minutes, then also stood up, disposed of his drink cup, and left the mall. FBI agents attempted to follow both men. One team stayed with Garrett, who drove directly home without stops. Another team attempted to follow the other man, but he left through a different exit, entered the parking garage, and drove away before agents could position themselves to follow effectively. The surveillance team noted the vehicle's license plate number and later determined the car was registered to a rental company. This incident, what intelligence professionals call a brush contact, was the first concrete indication Garrett might be engaged in intelligence activity. His behavior before the meeting, the counter-surveillance route through the mall, the seemingly purposeless wandering, the doubling back, was consistent with standard tradecraft designed to detect or evade surveillance. The brief, apparently casual contact with another person was consistent with a meeting between an intelligence asset and a handler. However, the evidence remained circumstantial. It was possible, though perhaps unlikely, that the entire sequence had been coincidental. The FBI needed more before justifying an arrest or search warrant. Surveillance continued with increased intensity. Over the following 2 months, agents documented Garrett's activities in extensive detail, photographing everyone he met, everyone he spoke to, everywhere he went. They analyzed his travel patterns, financial transactions, and telephone calls, seeking additional signs of espionage activity. On January 23, 1983, Garrett traveled to Montreal, Canada, for what his wife later told FBI agents was a weekend trip to visit museums and historic sites. Garrett traveled alone, telling his wife he needed time away to think about business decisions. FBI agents coordinated with Canadian authorities to maintain surveillance while Garrett was in Montreal. According to surveillance reports, Garrett checked into a hotel near downtown Montreal on the evening of January 23rd. The following day, he visited several tourist attractions, including the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts and Notre Dame Basilica. He ate lunch at a restaurant in Old Montreal. In the afternoon, he took the metro to a station near Parc La Fontaine. At the park, Garrett walked along paths around the lake in the park's center. He stopped at a bench near the southeastern corner of the lake and sat down. After approximately 10 minutes, a man approached and sat on the same bench. The two men appeared to engage in conversation for approximately 15 minutes. Then both stood and walked in opposite directions. Canadian surveillance agents photographed the other man and attempted to follow him, but he entered a metro station and disappeared into the subway system. Analysis of photographs later identified the man as Viktor Petrovich Sokolov, a 42-year-old cultural attaché at the Soviet consulate in Montreal, who was believed to be a KGB intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. This was the evidence the FBI had been seeking. A documented meeting between Thomas Garrett and a known Soviet intelligence officer constituted strong probable cause that Garrett was engaged in espionage. The FBI immediately intensified its investigation, seeking to gather additional evidence before making an arrest. For 6 weeks, the FBI maintained constant surveillance of Garrett, documenting every meeting, every trip, every telephone call. They analyzed patterns in his behavior, looking for additional clandestine contacts or dead drop operations. They coordinated with other FBI field offices and foreign intelligence services to determine if Garrett was part of a larger network of Soviet assets. The decision to arrest Garrett was made on March 16, 1983. FBI leadership determined they had sufficient evidence to charge Garrett with espionage, and that waiting longer risked the possibility that Garrett might detect surveillance and flee, or that his Soviet handlers might become aware of FBI interest and instruct him to cease activities or leave the country. The arrest was executed early on the morning of March 17th. FBI agents executed simultaneous search warrants at Garrett's townhouse and office. Garrett was taken into custody without incident. According to arresting agents' reports, he appeared shocked and initially denied any knowledge of espionage, claiming the meeting in Montreal had been a chance encounter with a stranger. The search of Garrett's office produced relatively little evidentiary value: business files, computer equipment, client records, but nothing obviously relating to espionage. The search of his townhouse proved more productive. In addition to the notebook Catherine Rhodes found in the basement, agents discovered a Minox camera designed for photographing documents, several rolls of undeveloped film, a one-time pad used for encoding and decoding messages, and approximately $14. 000 in cash hidden in various locations throughout the house. The blue notebook was transported to the FBI's Washington field office later that same day. A Russian-language translator was brought in to begin translating the entries written in Russian. What emerged from that translation would prove far more significant than anyone had initially anticipated. The notebook contained entries dating back to 1977, 6 years before Garrett's arrest. Entries were not written in complete sentences or narrative form. Instead, they consisted of fragments: names, dates, locations, amounts of money, brief descriptions of meetings or tasks. The notebook appeared to function as a personal record or aide memoir that Garrett had kept to help him track his espionage activities. Some entries were straightforward. For example, an entry dated June 12, 1978 read, "Meeting, DuPont Circle, 5:30 p.m., package delivered, received $3,500. Another entry, dated September 3, 1979, read, "Called Montreal number, instructions received, next contact October 15th. Other entries were more cryptic. Some used initials or code names rather than full names. Some referenced documents or information without describing what those documents contained. Some appeared to be notes about tradecraft or security procedures. Always check for surveillance before dead drop. use payphone, never home phone for sensitive calls, destroy notes after memorizing. What made the notebook particularly valuable to the FBI was not the information it provided about Garrett's own activities, though that was certainly useful for prosecution. Rather, it was the glimpses the notebook provided into a broader network of Soviet intelligence operations. Several entries referenced other individuals by name or initial. An entry from April 1980 read, V mentioned new recruit, engineer, defense contractor, Midwest. Very promising. Another entry from November 1981 read, coordination needed with DR operation. Avoid overlap. Moscow concerned about security. The notebook also contained what appeared to be lists of targets or objectives. One page, not specifically dated, but appearing to have been written in late 1979, based on its position in the notebook, contained a list of companies: Raytheon, Lockheed, Hughes Aircraft, TRW, General Dynamics, Martin Marietta. Next to some company names were check marks. Next to others were question marks. The implication was clear. These were defense contractors that Soviet intelligence was targeting for recruitment of assets. Another page contained a list of technologies or programs: stealth technology, satellite communications, cruise missile guidance, radar systems, encryption protocols. Again, some items had check marks, some had question marks, and some were unmarked. This appeared to be a collection priority list. Areas of interest to Soviet intelligence based on strategic military value. FBI analysts began the painstaking process of cross-referencing the names, initials, dates, and locations mentioned in Garrett's notebook against other counterintelligence investigations, against databases of individuals with security clearances, and against patterns of suspicious activity that had been noted but not fully investigated. One of the first significant connections emerged within a week of the notebook's discovery. An entry in Garrett's notebook from May 1981 read, Dinner with M.K. discussed electronics, potential recruitment, needs time. FBI analysts searching databases of individuals with security clearances and employment at defense contractors identified a man whose initials were M.K., Martin Kenneth Lawson, a 38-year-old electrical engineer who worked for a company in suburban Maryland that developed electronic warfare systems for military aircraft. The FBI had no active investigation of Lawson, but a review of security files showed he had been flagged during a routine background check update in 1982 for unexplained foreign travel. Lawson had taken a vacation to Mexico City in 1981, shortly after the date of the dinner mentioned in Garrett's notebook. When asked about the trip during his security interview, Lawson said he had gone to Mexico City to visit archaeological sites and museums. The security interviewer noted that Lawson had traveled alone, which was unusual but not necessarily suspicious. Based on the reference in Garrett's notebook, the FBI opened an investigation of Martin Lawson. Surveillance revealed that Lawson's behavior and lifestyle appeared normal. He lived with his wife and 2 children in a suburban house, commuted to work, attended his children's soccer games on weekends. However, telephone records showed Lawson had received several calls from payphones over the previous 18 months. The calls had been brief, typically less than 1 minute. Pay phone calls to a residence were unusual enough to warrant closer examination. The FBI obtained authorization for a wiretap on Lawson's home telephone. On April 8, 1983, 3 weeks after Garrett's arrest, the wiretap recorded an incoming call at approximately 8:15 p.m. The caller's voice was male, and the conversation was brief. Caller: Hello, may I speak with Martin? Lawson's wife. Just a moment. Sounds of phone being passed. Lawson. Hello? Caller. I wanted to confirm our meeting tomorrow. Same location as last time. Lawson. I understand. What time? Caller. 2:00. Lawson. I'll be there. Call ends. The following day, April 9th, FBI agents maintained surveillance of Lawson. At approximately 1:30 p.m., Lawson left his workplace during what appeared to be a lunch break. He drove to a shopping center in Silver Spring, Maryland, and parked near a restaurant. He entered the restaurant and sat at a table in a section near the back. At approximately 2:05 p.m., a man entered the restaurant and joined Lawson at his table. The two men appeared to engage in conversation while eating lunch. The meeting lasted approximately 40 minutes. FBI agents positioned outside the restaurant photographed both men entering and exiting. Analysis of photographs identified the second man as Dmitry Alexandrovich Kuznetsov, a 45-year-old commercial counselor at the Soviet embassy in Washington who was believed to be affiliated with Soviet military intelligence. Based on this surveillance, combined with the reference in Garrett's notebook, the FBI arrested Martin Lawson on April 12, 1983. A search of Lawson's home produced evidence similar to what had been found at Garrett's townhouse: a camera designed for photographing documents, approximately $9,000 in cash, and handwritten notes that appeared to be copied from classified documents relating to electronic warfare systems. Lawson, faced with the surveillance evidence and the materials found in his home, agreed to cooperate with FBI investigators. During his debriefing sessions, conducted over several weeks in April and May 1983, Lawson provided information that significantly expanded the FBI's understanding of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. According to Lawson's account, he had first been approached by a Soviet recruiter in 1980. The recruiter, whose name Lawson said he never knew, had made contact at a professional conference in Atlanta, where Lawson had been presenting research on signal processing techniques. The initial approach had been casual, a conversation about shared professional interests. Over several months, through occasional telephone calls and a few meetings, the relationship had developed. The recruiter had eventually revealed that he worked for Soviet intelligence and had asked if Lawson would be willing to provide information about his work. Lawson told FBI interrogators that he had initially refused, but that he had been experiencing financial difficulties at the time. His wife had medical expenses not fully covered by insurance, and he had accumulated credit card debt. The Soviet recruiter had offered money, initially small amounts for relatively innocuous information. Lawson claimed he had rationalized his actions by telling himself that the information he was providing was not critically important and that he desperately needed the money. Over time, however, the information requested had become more sensitive, and Lawson had found himself unable to extricate himself from the relationship without risking exposure. Lawson's account included details about how the recruitment and handling had been structured. He described receiving instructions through brief telephone calls from payphones, which explained the pattern the FBI had observed in his phone records. He described dead drop locations, where he would leave photographed documents, and where he would collect payments. He described signals he was supposed to use to indicate when he had information to deliver, or when he needed an emergency meeting. Importantly, Lawson also provided information about other individuals he had been told were part of the same intelligence network, though he claimed never to have met them and to know them only by first names or code names. He mentioned someone referred to as the professor who worked at a university and provided assessments of U.S. defense policy. He mentioned someone called David who worked for a technology company in California and provided information about computer systems. He mentioned someone called Anna who worked for a government agency in Washington and provided information about intelligence community activities. FBI analysts began attempting to identify these individuals based on Lawson's limited descriptions and cross-references with other information in Garrett's notebook. The notebook contained an entry from March 1982 that read, "Professor's analysis very valuable, Moscow pleased. Continue cultivation." Another entry from August 1982 read, "D in California productive. Consider increasing payment, retention important." The investigation had now expanded from a single case, Thomas Garrett, into a major counterintelligence operation aimed at identifying and dismantling what appeared to be a network of Soviet intelligence assets operating in the United States. The FBI assigned additional agents to the investigation and established a dedicated task force to coordinate the effort. One of the agents assigned to the task force was a 33-year-old analyst named Robert Chen, who specialized in pattern recognition and network analysis. Chen had joined the FBI in 1977 after completing a Ph.D. in mathematics. His role in counterintelligence was to examine data from multiple sources, surveillance reports, financial records, telephone logs, travel records, and identify connections and patterns that might not be obvious to individual agents focused on specific targets. Chen spent weeks analyzing information in Garrett's notebook alongside information from other investigations. He created charts and timelines showing relationships, meetings, financial transactions, and travel. He looked for overlaps, for common locations, for temporal correlations that might indicate coordinated activity. One pattern that emerged from Chen's analysis involved a series of trips to Canada made by various individuals over a 3-year period. Garrett had made 7 trips to Montreal between 1980 and 1983. Lawson had made 1 trip to Montreal in 1981. Chen identified 3 other individuals who had made multiple trips to Montreal during the same period: a defense contractor employee from Virginia, a university professor from Massachusetts, and a software engineer from California. None of these individuals were currently under investigation, but all had security clearances and access to sensitive information. The trips themselves were not coordinated in time. The individuals had traveled on different dates and for different stated reasons. However, the fact that multiple people with access to classified information had made multiple trips to the same city, where there was a Soviet consulate with known KGB presence, suggested the possibility of a pattern. The FBI opened investigations of all 3 individuals. Surveillance and records analysis revealed varying levels of suspicious activity. The defense contractor employee from Virginia showed signs of unexplained income and had made several large cash deposits. The university professor from Massachusetts had published articles and given interviews that were notably sympathetic to Soviet positions on arms control and foreign policy. The software engineer from California had received multiple telephone calls from payphones. On May 24, 1983, FBI agents arrested the defense contractor employee from Virginia, a 51-year-old man named Harold Peterson, who worked for a company that developed satellite communication systems. A search of Peterson's home produced evidence similar to what had been found in the Garrett and Lawson cases: photographing equipment, coded notes, and cash. Peterson initially refused to cooperate with investigators, but after being confronted with the evidence against him, he eventually provided limited information about his recruitment and handling by Soviet intelligence. The university professor from Massachusetts was not arrested immediately. Instead, the FBI maintained surveillance and continued gathering evidence. In June 1983, the professor traveled to a conference in West Germany. While abroad, he met with an individual who was later identified as a KGB officer stationed in East Berlin. The FBI, coordinating with West German intelligence services, documented the meeting. Upon the professor's return to the United States, he was arrested at Logan International Airport in Boston. The software engineer from California was arrested in July 1983 after FBI surveillance documented a dead drop operation in which he photographed documents at his workplace and then left the film at a location in a public park, where it was later retrieved by a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet consulate in San Francisco. By August 1983, 5 months after Thomas Garrett's initial arrest, the FBI had arrested a total of 6 individuals connected to what appeared to be a coordinated Soviet intelligence network: Garrett, Lawson, Peterson, the university professor named Richard Brennan, the software engineer named David Chen, no relation to FBI analyst Robert Chen, and one additional individual, a woman named Anna Kowalski, who worked as a translator at the State Department and who had been identified based on Lawson's reference to someone called Anna who worked for a government agency. The notebook that Catherine Rhodes had found in Thomas Garrett's basement had been the investigative catalyst. Without that notebook, the FBI would have had evidence to prosecute Garrett himself, but the connections to the broader network might never have been discovered. The notebook had provided names, dates, and operational details that allowed investigators to identify patterns and connections they might otherwise have missed. The 6 individuals arrested in 1983 faced federal charges of conspiracy to commit espionage and unauthorized communication of national defense information. All 6 eventually pleaded guilty, though the terms and conditions of their plea agreements varied. Garrett and Peterson, who were judged to have provided the most damaging information and who were least cooperative with investigators, received sentences of 35 and 32 years respectively. Lawson, Brennan, and David Chen, who cooperated more fully, received sentences ranging from 18 to 25 years. Anna Kowalski, who had provided relatively limited information and who had cooperated extensively, received a sentence of 12 years. The damage assessment conducted by the FBI and Department of Defense concluded that the network of 6 assets had compromised information relating to at least 15 separate classified programs over approximately 7 years. The programs involved satellite communications, electronic warfare systems, radar technology, stealth aircraft development, and cryptographic protocols. The assessment concluded that the information provided to Soviet intelligence had given the Soviet Union significant insights into U.S. military capabilities and had potentially allowed the development of countermeasures that could reduce the effectiveness of U.S. weapons systems. The financial compensation received by the 6 assets had varied, but had been surprisingly modest in all cases. Garrett had received approximately $47,000 over 6 years. Lawson had received approximately $28,000 over 3 years. Peterson had received approximately $52,000 over 5 years. The other 3 had received smaller amounts. The broader question of why individuals choose to commit espionage against their own country revealed complex motivational profiles. Brennan appeared motivated primarily by ideological sympathy with Soviet positions on arms control and foreign policy. Lawson was driven primarily by financial pressure, though he also exhibited a need for recognition and validation. Peterson showed a combination of financial gain and resentment toward his employers and the government. Garrett demonstrated a complex mixture of intellectual engagement, political views, and psychological factors. Chen appeared motivated by a sense of alienation and a desire to feel important. Kowalski appeared initially motivated by romantic involvement with her recruiter, and later by fear and a sense of being trapped. None of these motivations excused their actions or diminished the harm they caused, but understanding them proved important for developing counterintelligence strategies designed to prevent recruitment, identify vulnerable individuals, and create systems that reduce the likelihood of espionage. The Soviet intelligence officers who had recruited and handled these assets were protected by diplomatic immunity and could not be prosecuted under U.S. law. However, several were declared persona non grata and were expelled from the United States. Viktor Sokolov, who had met with Garrett in Montreal, was expelled from Canada. Dmitry Kuznetsov, who had handled Lawson, was expelled from the United States, along with 3 other Soviet diplomats who had been identified through the investigation as probable intelligence officers. The impact of the arrests on the families of the convicted assets was uniformly severe. Thomas Garrett's wife, Linda, filed for divorce in 1984. Their daughter, Jennifer, who was 17 when her father was arrested, struggled with depression and left college after 1 semester. According to later accounts, she worked a series of retail jobs and had difficulty maintaining stable relationships. In interviews given years later to researchers, Jennifer Garrett described the experience of learning about her father's espionage as devastating to her sense of identity and trust. Martin Lawson's wife, Patricia, remained married to him despite his imprisonment. She visited him regularly in prison and maintained that she had been unaware of his espionage activities. Their 2 children, both in elementary school at the time of Lawson's arrest, were told initially that their father was away for work. As they grew older and learned the truth, both experienced difficulties. The older child, a son, became withdrawn and performed poorly in school. The younger child, a daughter, developed anxiety disorders that required treatment. Harold Peterson's wife had died 2 years before his arrest. He had 2 adult children who both distanced themselves from him after his conviction. Neither visited him in prison, and both later legally changed their surnames to distance themselves from their father's notoriety. Richard Brennan, the university professor, had been divorced for several years before his arrest and had no children. However, his arrest created significant controversy in academic circles. Colleagues who had worked with him for years expressed shock and bewilderment. Some defended him, arguing that his academic work had been legitimate even if his intelligence activities had been inappropriate. Others condemned him as having betrayed the principles of academic freedom and intellectual honesty. David Chen, the software engineer, had been married for only 2 years when he was arrested. His wife, who had been unaware of his espionage, left him immediately upon learning of his activities. She later described feeling that her entire marriage had been based on deception and that she had never truly known the person she had married. Anna Kowalski had been single at the time of her arrest. She was the youngest of the 6 convicted assets, only 29 years old when arrested. According to her later testimony, she had been recruited while working as a translator at an international conference where she had met a man who identified himself as a Soviet cultural official but who was actually a KGB recruiter. She had been flattered by his attention and had been gradually drawn into providing information, initially believing that she was simply helping to promote understanding between the United States and the Soviet Union. By the time she realized the true nature of what she was doing, she felt trapped and unable to extricate herself without facing consequences. The 6 convicted assets all served substantial portions of their sentences. Thomas Garrett was released in 2012 after serving 29 years. He was 75 years old at the time of his release. He moved to a retirement facility in Florida and lived quietly until his death in 2017. According to the few people who knew him during his final years, he rarely spoke about his past and maintained almost no contact with his former family or friends. Martin Lawson was released in 2001 after serving 18 years. He returned to live with his wife, who had waited for him. However, his relationships with his children remained strained. Both children were adults by the time of his release and had built lives that did not include him. Lawson worked part-time at a hardware store until his retirement and died in 2019. Harold Peterson was released in 2009 after serving 26 years. He moved to a small apartment in Pennsylvania and worked briefly doing technical writing before health problems forced him to stop. He died in 2014, largely isolated from his family and former associates. Richard Brennan was released in 2003 after serving 20 years. He moved to a small town in Oregon and lived on Social Security benefits. He occasionally gave interviews to researchers studying Cold War espionage, though he was never fully forthcoming about his motivations or the extent of his activities. He died in 2016. David Chen was released in 2000 after serving 17 years. He moved to a different state and took a job unrelated to technology, working in maintenance at an apartment complex. According to later accounts, he struggled with guilt and regret for years after his release. He died by suicide in 2008, leaving a note that mentioned his shame over what he had done and his inability to repair the relationships he had destroyed. Anna Kowalski was released in 1995 after serving 12 years, the shortest sentence of the 6. She was only 41 years old at the time of her release. She moved to a different city, changed her name, and worked as a retail manager. In the early 2000s, she gave an interview to a researcher studying women in espionage cases, in which she described her recruitment and activities with what appeared to be genuine remorse. She acknowledged that she had been naive and had made terrible choices that had harmed her country and destroyed her own life. She died in 2020. The Garrett case led to several changes in security protocols at defense contractors and government agencies. Background checks were enhanced to include more thorough examination of foreign travel, unexplained financial transactions, and patterns of behavior that might indicate security risks. Polygraph examinations became more frequent for individuals with access to highly classified information. Security awareness training was expanded to include more explicit warnings about recruitment techniques used by foreign intelligence services. The case also led to increased attention to the human factors in espionage. Security officials recognized that purely technical or procedural approaches to security were insufficient if they did not account for the psychological, social, and economic pressures that could make individuals vulnerable to recruitment. Programs were developed to provide support for employees experiencing financial difficulties, to create channels for employees to report security concerns without fear of retaliation, and to foster a culture in which security was seen as everyone's responsibility rather than simply the responsibility of security officers. Catherine Rhodes, the FBI agent who discovered the notebook in Thomas Garrett's basement, continued working counterintelligence cases until her retirement from the FBI in 1998. In interviews given after her retirement, she reflected on the significance of the Garrett case and the role that the notebook had played. She noted that while the notebook had been crucial to the investigation's success, its discovery had been somewhat fortuitous. Had Garrett hidden it more carefully? Or had agents conducting the search been less thorough, it might never have been found. Rhodes emphasized that successful counterintelligence work required a combination of systematic methodology and attention to detail. Agents needed to follow established procedures for conducting searches, but they also needed to be alert to anything that seemed unusual or out of place. The notebook had been hidden beneath tax records in a box labeled for tax records, which was a simple form of concealment. A less thorough search might have looked at the tax records on top and assumed the entire box contained only tax records. Robert Chen, the FBI analyst who had identified patterns in the data and had helped connect the individual cases into a broader network, also reflected on the investigation in later years. He noted that intelligence analysis, like detective work, involved both inductive and deductive reasoning. Investigators had specific evidence: the notebook, the surveillance, the financial records, and they had to induce from that evidence what the broader pattern might be. Then they had to deduce what additional evidence they should look for if that pattern was real. The process was iterative, moving back and forth between evidence and hypothesis, gradually building a more complete picture. The question of what the Soviet Union gained from the intelligence provided by the 6 assets is difficult to answer definitively. Intelligence collection is a cumulative process in which many small pieces of information are assembled over time to create strategic advantage. The information provided by Garrett and the others would have been combined with information from other sources: signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, open-source intelligence, and human intelligence from other assets to give Soviet military planners a clearer understanding of U.S. capabilities and intentions. It is possible that specific Soviet weapons systems or tactics were modified based on information derived from this network. It is possible that Soviet negotiating positions in arms control talks were informed by assessments based partly on this intelligence. It is possible that Soviet military planning was influenced by insights into U.S. technical capabilities. But intelligence, by its nature, operates in the background, informing decisions without being the sole determinant of those decisions. What remains clearer is the human cost. 6 individuals destroyed their own lives and severely damaged the lives of their families. Thomas Garrett lost his freedom, his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, and decades of his life to imprisonment. His wife spent years dealing with the financial and emotional aftermath. His daughter grew up in the shadow of her father's crimes, struggling with shame, confusion, and a sense of betrayal. Martin Lawson caused similar harm to his wife and children, who loved him and trusted him, and who had their lives disrupted by consequences of choices he made without their knowledge. Harold Peterson died estranged from his children, having destroyed whatever relationship he might have had with them. Richard Brennan lost his academic career and spent 2 decades in prison. David Chen suffered such profound guilt and shame that he ultimately took his own life. Anna Kowalski spent 12 years in prison and then lived under an assumed name, forever separated from the life she had known. The families of these individuals, spouses, children, parents, siblings, were all secondary victims who bore consequences they did not deserve and did not choose. The children particularly represent the tragic dimension of these cases. They had no knowledge of their parents' activities, no opportunity to prevent or influence those activities, and no responsibility for them. Yet they suffered profound harm: psychological trauma, social stigma, financial hardship, disrupted education, damaged relationships, and a lifelong struggle with questions of identity and trust. The question of whether intelligence and counterintelligence operations can be conducted without causing harm to innocent people has no satisfactory answer. The 6 individuals arrested in 1983 made choices that harmed their country's security. The FBI agents who investigated them were doing their jobs to protect national security. The prosecutors who charged them were enforcing laws designed to punish espionage. The judges who sentenced them were applying legal standards for punishment. Everyone involved in the system was acting according to the logic and requirements of their roles. But the system as a whole created outcomes that caused immense human suffering. The spouses and children of the convicted assets suffered despite having done nothing wrong. The Soviet intelligence officers who recruited and handled the assets operated within a system that treated human beings as tools to be exploited for state purposes. The American security system that created the classifications and clearances and secrets that made espionage valuable also created opportunities and incentives for people to betray those secrets. The notebook discovered by Catherine Rhodes on March 17, 1983, became evidence in multiple prosecutions, a training tool for counterintelligence professionals, and eventually a historical document preserved in the National Archives. It revealed operational details about how Soviet intelligence structured its networks, how assets were compartmented and managed, how communications were conducted, and how collection priorities were established. But it also revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in human intelligence operations. Garrett's decision to keep a written record of his activities, despite the security risks, represented either a failure to follow instructions or a psychological need that overrode his security training. FBI analysts who studied the case noted that many intelligence assets, despite extensive training in security protocols, make similar mistakes. Some keep records because they want to remember details. Some do so as a form of personal validation. Some do so because they unconsciously want to be caught, and some simply fail to fully appreciate the risk. Thomas Garrett was 46 years old when he was arrested, 47 when he was sentenced, 75 when he was released, and 80 when he died. The notebook documented 6 years of his life, from 1977 to 1983. But the consequences of those 6 years extended across the next 34 years, through imprisonment, through the collapse of his family, through decades of separation from everyone he had known, through a final few years living among strangers who knew nothing of his past. The notebook itself was paper and ink, handwriting in 2 languages, water stains and wear from handling. But it was also a record of choices made, of rationalizations accepted, of risks taken, of betrayals committed. Each entry represented a moment when someone decided to prioritize their own interests or beliefs or needs over their obligations to their country, their colleagues, their family. Each entry represented a step deeper into deception. Each entry represented a choice that would eventually have consequences extending far beyond what the person making that choice imagined at the time. And in the end, that simple blue composition notebook with water-stained edges became the key that unlocked not just one man's crimes, but an entire network's exposure, and with it, the destruction of multiple families and the unraveling of lives that could never be rebuilt.